Yes, I do wear primarily the same pair of clothes every shot, if you guys are wondering. Joking aside, this is the start of week 5. I consider it the superstructure continued, but what we're really going to primarily be working on is establishing the initial framing for the cabover section. As a little side note here, you guys can see I'm trimming off some of the excess from those joints up there using a Milwaukee, they call it the hacksaw as opposed to the sawzall. What a wonderful little tool, but we'll talk about that later. Here, more of that classic laminating, a little bit better of an image of this. And you'll see I'm making the columns here that will link the horizontal beams for the cabover to the tub itself. This laminating method, as we've talked about in the previous week, is time consuming, but it really, I really appreciate the opportunities it presents. So here are those laminated columns going in place on that front portion of the tub. I believe we spoke about it last week that though that portion of the tub actually has a slight curve to it, being a little bit longer in the front. Now that curve and the benefits of that will come into play in later weeks. But these columns, as you can see, are put in place, and I'm actually attaching them via glue, and the primary strength of that's going to be from a large screw that I'm driving underneath. Again, more laminating. These will be the beams that will run horizontal out across and define the cabover shape. You'll note that I have the same kind of joint system that I used for the columns above the camper spot. All right, let me catch you guys up a bit. So we've built the frame structure for the portion that will make the camper section, a place that you stand up in and live in, so to speak. Now we're making the cabover, okay? So what I've done is I've made 3 beams and 3 beams that go vertical coming off the front half here. Just as I did up here, I created a joint that these sit in. Now you guys see right here I have a support structure that I just put together with some scrap wood. And this is going to be in place for a while. Don't expect these beams to support themselves for much of the framing process of the cabover, and that's totally normal. Now these beams are not glued and secured yet. I'm still making some final adjustments. And that kind of brings up the next interesting point is doing the cabover. It's critical that you take your time, because the adjustments you make and the cuts that you make here will have significant impacts on the rest of the layout of the camper as we go. And it may not be just as simple as finding a 90-degree angle here. So what I did is I essentially took the tub and shimmed it to where it's in place, and it's about as level as I'm going to get. My garage, and I'm going to go off on a limb and say most garages have a slight angle to them. So once I know that the tub is level, then from there I can make sure and ensure that these are level. But that's these vertical support beams, though, you also have to try to make sure that they are perfectly level up and down. So it's kind of a complex play between all of them. My decision is I typically err on, if I'm going to have these where they're as level as they can be, but they're arched up just a little bit, because that way if there's any weight and there's some mild sinking, I think it looks better if, in my opinion, I think the cabover looks a little better if it's arched up a little bit as opposed to if it's sunk down. It looks like it's going to break off. So this is a critical part. We'll go forward from here and I'll show you guys a few more things. Let me take the camera around though and show you those joints that I was talking about. Let's see if you guys can see that right there. There we go. So you can see, now those are not glued and secured yet, but those are the joints that are going to hold it. Now, one thing to think about, guys, let's be honest, these vertical beams here are not really what's going to support the weight of this cab over section. The real structural strength is going to come in when we skin it and we put on the cedar planking. Remember I was talking to you guys about the fact that it almost functions like an exoskeleton? This framing, you know, definitely does provide some structural support, but if anything is more of the skeleton that kind of holds the skin in. Actually gluing in place the columns is a little bit of a frightening experience for me, because as I said, you want to get it right. And once you get them glued in place, once you get it done, there's no going back. So as you guys can see, it's all about measuring and leveling, and then measuring and leveling again, and measuring and leveling, because I know that stages like this are critical. And it's important that I sit back, take my time, and make sure that it's right. Okay, guys. So we've actually made a lot of progress. Now, it probably doesn't look that way, and that's going to be kind of a lesson of this project. Sometimes we can work for a week and get what looks to be an enormous amount of stuff done, and there's other times where we could work a week and it's barely noticeable about anything done. But let me explain what we did. First, it starts right here with this beam. Maybe it's just me, but I literally sat and spent hours kind of imagining, because this right here, there's a lot of angles in this that are going to be critical later, and getting this right is going to be a big part. This is just laminated pieces of cedar set at a 22-degree angle. As you guys can see, the front cap of this will be angled just like Camper 2.0. However, it's going to have a little something different, and I'm going to keep that a secret until later, but it will become obvious perhaps maybe even in the next 2 videos, maybe. We'll see. Right now, the last discussion I had, these were not set in place with glue and screws. Now they are. I have them leveled out and they're set in place by the stand, and like I said, I'm going to tip them up in a little bit of a upward orientation. That way, if they sag a little bit, I can basically account for that better than I can if they're a little bit lower. And then right here, this is a very important piece, and this is also another start of the discussion about differential use of materials. I talked about this in 2.0, Camper 2.0, that though most of this structure is made out of cedar for its lightness, its weather resistant, other factors, there are places where you want to use, or at least I chose, to use a different kind of wood that I believe will provide a little bit more structural strength. And right here is this. I chose to use poplar, which is a hardwood, so it's definitely stronger and harder than the cedar. I don't know how it compares in strength to oak, for example, but this is dimensionally 1-inch thick piece of poplar, about 3 inches wide. This same board I'm also going to use for the door structure, the door frame, a little bit later. But this piece is tied in here. It's got great big lag screws here in the side of the frame on both sides, in the front, and then it ties in each one of these beams, okay? So this whole thing is locked in place by this and its attachment to the tub. So this was a very critical piece. So I've recently set the glue, so I'm not going to disturb this. I'm going to let it set up for ensure the glue gets hardened. But let me show you guys one more thing here. Inside of here, let's come around here. Down there, you'll see that beam that comes down, and that's also very important. That ties in with 3 big screws into that sandwiched lip that runs across the top of the tub. That lip then ties into these beams. That big board right there is glued and screwed to the front of that 3/4 piece of the tub. So that part forms a structural element that ties all of these in together. Now that beam down there will also become important later when we install the table, okay? So I haven't made up my mind if I'm going to use a lagoon mount or try to make something on my own, but regardless, it's going to mount right there on that beam, and you want a very rigid structure for that table to mount on. All right, guys? So we'll catch up. I think I might have missed a little bit of time lapse on some of this, but I think you guys get the gist. Thanks. As you can see from montages like this, there's certain tools that you just couldn't get by without. That table saw is certainly one of those. Sometimes I think it's interesting looking from my perspective of all of these time lapses, because you can see the tools that are always in the picture, the tools that I'm always using, the places I'm always standing. Especially for this laminating process, there's a lot of cutting down the individual pieces to the proper width. And then what do you always see? You see that red cordless brad nailer. There's got to be 10,000 brad nails in this when this is done. Again, an indispensable tool. Here, we're just continuing building out the cabover section. It's interesting. A lot of times we think of building as, building one major component piece and then putting it in place. The interesting thing about this camper is we're essentially building on as we go, little bit by little bit. It looks like a little hardcore shot here. You can actually see the dust on the camera lens there. That's just the reality of what's going on in this garage. It's getting real, so to speak, I guess you could say. All right, hello guys. Obviously this is not the time lapse putting this on. I'll save you guys and myself the embarrassment. It was a little awkward to put it on myself. But so what we did is, you guys saw the primary frame structure up here in the front. I put this piece that will define the front edge. I'll trim this off at a later time. And then obviously I put down this 1/4 inch piece of pre-finished ply, which will make the floor of the cabover section. Now, a couple things of note here. Number one, on this poplar piece that we had talked about earlier, I had actually routed a groove underneath it, so when I put this on, I slid this 1/4 inch piece of plywood right underneath this groove. Okay? The plywood went over top. I squared off the front cabover section, and then I used 18 gauge brad nailers with wood glue to attach this to the structure. The wood glue is actually still drying as we speak. Then I took off a router with a cutoff bit, and I cut off the edges. Now, one thing I want to show you guys right here that I think is pretty neat is, now this is kind of comes back to the idea of taking risks from a design factor. So do you guys see that right there? So what I did is, in the cabover section, there's going to be a slight curve inward toward the front, okay? And that's just to add a little bit of style, and maybe even perhaps a bit of aerodynamic benefit. Now, probably is a little hard to see right here, but it will come to full view once I get the rest of the cabover up, and particularly when it's skinned. Right here, what I'm going to do in the front should be quite obvious. So it's going to have, sorry about that, it's going to have this beam piece at 22-degree angle, and there'll be one here and one on the end, so an additional 4. And then the front cap is going to angle out, as you guys can see here, and this is at 10 degrees, okay? So you'll have a 22.5-degree back swept and then a 10-degree V in the front. Now, I'll admit, this is kind of a radical design, but that's kind of what makes this fun, and we'll see how it's going to turn out. I think it's going to be pretty aerodynamic for what it is, and I think it will also be pretty cool and pretty unusual. So, hey guys, for what will be week 2 of the superstructure build, we are going to stop here, and then we will pick it up for one more. It'll probably take me about 1 more week, because the next steps are going to be to build the framing structure of the cabover, tie it in with the main camper section, and then there's going to be some various support pieces and so forth that will define the roof line that we'll talk about later. But I think we're making great progress, and I will see you guys on Live on Tuesday.